In the spring of 2003, a man named Virgil Pratt stood at the edge of his 42 acres outside Colfax County, Nebraska, and watched a Slaughterhouse truck back up to the low side of his field for the third time that week. The driver barely looked at him. The load gate swung down, and a cascade of cattle bones tumbled, femurs and vertebrae and rib sections still faintly pink at the joint, into a shallow depression at the property line, the way a man empties a dustpan. Then the truck pulled forward and was gone before the dust settled. Virgil stood there a moment. He did not curse. He did not wave his hands. He turned and walked back to his barn. That same spring, a ceramics buyer named Dale Fitch from Omaha drove out to Colfax County to look at a pottery operation he had agreed to evaluate on behalf of a regional craft goods distributor. He expected to find something quaint. What he found instead was a man hauling bone ash in a wheelbarrow across a yard that smelled faintly of wood smoke, feeding a kiln that had no business being on a working cattle property. Dale walked the perimeter, consulted his clipboard, and told Virgil, without unkindness, that the whole operation looked like a hobby that had gotten too comfortable. He left his business card on a fence post. Virgil found it there 3 days later and used it to mark his place in a borrowed library book about the history of English porcelain. 11 years after that, in the autumn of 2014, a single invoice crossed the desk of a specialty tableware importer in Kansas City. The order was for 48 place settings of translucent, bone-white dinnerware, each piece carrying a specific gravity and luminosity the importer had not seen in domestic ware in 2 decades of buying. The price per place setting was $460. The importer paid without negotiating. That number, $460, came from 42 acres in Colfax County and from 14 years of bone that nobody else wanted. This is the story of how Virgil Pratt got there and why it took a ceramics expert, a structural drought, and a library book from 1947 to prove that a slaughterhouse's disposal problem was actually a fortune in the ground. Let me tell you what bone china really is, because the word gets used loosely and the truth of it matters to everything that follows. True bone china is not a marketing term. It is a specific ceramic body that requires a minimum of 30% calcined bone ash by weight, mixed with Cornish stone and kaolin clay in exacting ratios, fired at temperatures that would destroy ordinary earthenware. The bone ash is what does the work. When bone is reduced to ash through a process called calcination, heated slowly and cleanly to temperatures above 1,000 degrees Celsius, the organic matter burns away, and what remains is calcium phosphate in an almost pure crystalline form. That calcium phosphate, when fired again inside a ceramic body, creates a translucency that no other common material replicates at the same temperature range. Light passes through true bone china in a way it does not pass through stoneware or porcelain. Hold a bone china cup up to a window and you can see the shadow of your hand through the wall of the piece. That is not artistry. That is chemistry. And the chemistry depends entirely on the quality and source of the bone ash. Virgil Pratt knew none of this in 2003. What he knew was that the slaughterhouse 3 miles north had been leasing a dump easement across the low corner of his property since 1989, an arrangement his father had made in exchange for a modest annual payment that barely covered his property taxes on that corner. When Virgil inherited the land in 2001, he inherited the arrangement too. He was 37 years old, running a small cow-calf operation on the good pasture acres, and the low corner was boggy in wet years and mostly useless. The bones piled there through the seasons. Crows worked them. Grass grew through them. Rain bleached them white. By the spring of 2003, the pile was substantial. And Virgil had started to wonder in the way a man wonders about something he has no language for yet. Whether there was a use for it he hadn't thought of. The library book was what gave him the language. He had checked it out on a whim, a volume called The English Ceramic Tradition, published in London in 1947, sitting on the bottom shelf of the Colfax County branch, as if it had been waiting for someone to need it. He read it at his kitchen table over 3 evenings, a single overhead bulb above him, a cup of bad coffee going cold at his elbow. The chapter on calcination was 12 pages long and drier than the bone pile itself, but Virgil read it twice. He dog-eared the page with the calcium phosphate diagram. He went to bed with a number in his head, 30% minimum. He lay there and did arithmetic in the dark. His neighbor to the east was a man named Chet Dolan, 44 years old, who had spent the better part of the previous decade financing a full complement of commercial pottery equipment. He had a gas-fired tunnel kiln he had hauled in on a flatbed, a pug mill for wedging clay, a jigger and jolly setup for production plate throwing, and a spray-glazed booth that looked clinical against the red of his barn. Chet made functional stoneware for the local gift market, mugs and casserole dishes, sold them at craft fairs and to a small regional chain of kitchen goods stores. His margins were thin and his output was high because that was the model his kiln required. You fed the tunnel kiln or you lost the investment. Virgil had an old electric test kiln he had bought from a retired teacher in Fremont for $250. He had no pug mill, no jigger, no spray booth. He had a bone pile and a library book. He started reading more of them. The Colfax County library system was modest, but Virgil was patient. He put in interlibrary loan requests for 3 more volumes on ceramic chemistry, and when they arrived, he read them in order, taking notes in the same composition notebook he used for cattle records. He learned that bone quality mattered. Cattle bone was traditionally considered superior for calcination because of its density and its calcium phosphate composition. The long bones of the leg and the flat sections of the pelvis and scapula were particularly valued. The slaughterhouse at the north end of his county was depositing almost exactly those bones because they had no commercial value as rendering stock. The rendering plant took the fat-bearing material. The bone went to Virgil's corner. He did not tell anyone what he was thinking. Not yet. He built a small calcination oven in 2004 from fire brick and a salvaged cast-iron door, following a diagram in the second of the library books. The fuel was wood, cut from a stand of dead elm along his fence line. He loaded the first charge of clean bone in October of that year, 140 pounds of cattle femur and pelvis he had sorted and cleaned by hand through the preceding weeks. The firing took 2 days at a slow, controlled rise. When he opened the door on the 3rd morning, the bone had transformed. It was chalk white, chalky light, reduced in weight by roughly half. He crumbled a piece in his gloved fingers. It came apart in a fine powder with almost no effort. He held it up in the October light and said nothing to anyone. His first test bodies were poor. He had bought kaolin and feldspar from a ceramics supply company in Lincoln, mixing by hand in a 5-gallon bucket, and his proportions were wrong, and his firing temperature was wrong, and the test tiles came out opaque and porous, nothing like what the library books described. He adjusted. He fired again. He kept notes. His cattle operation continued alongside. The calves going to market in spring and fall, the hay put up in summer, the routine of it unchanged. The bone china work happened in the evenings and on rainy days and in the winter when the stock required less from him. The early failures had a particular quality he learned to read. An underfired body came out chalky, soft at the surface, with no translucency and a sound like a cracked egg when you tapped it with a fingernail. An overfired body slumped and bloated, the bone ash compounds releasing gases the clay could not contain. Between the two extremes was a narrow band where the glass phase crystals formed cleanly, and locating that band in his specific kiln, with his specific fuel and his specific ashfall, and his particular Nebraska winter drafts, was a problem that could not be solved by the library books alone. It had to be measured by what came out of the oven, season by season, batch by batch. He fired 31 test batches between October of 2004 and the spring of 2006. He cataloged every one of them in the composition notebook with the fuel load, the ambient temperature, the duration of the rise, and a terse assessment. Opaque, slumped, bloated, promising. The word promising appeared for the first time in February of 2005, next to a tile that showed a faint internal luminosity when held at an angle to the shop light. He did not share that word with anyone either. By 2006, he had achieved translucency in a test tile for the first time. He held it up to the shop light above his workbench and saw the shadow of his thumb through the clay body. He stood there for a moment and then set the tile carefully on the bench and went back inside to write down what he had done. Chet Dolan, in 2006, had just signed a note on a second tunnel kiln because the regional chain of kitchen goods stores had offered him a production contract he felt he could not afford to refuse. The contract required 400 pieces per month at a price point that left him $11 of margin per piece before fuel. He told Virgil about it at the feed store in February, with a satisfaction that was genuine and unguarded. Virgil said it sounded like a solid arrangement. He bought a 50-pound bag of bone meal on the way home for a different experiment he was running on glaze chemistry. Dale Fitch came back to Colfax County in the fall of 2007. He was passing through on his way to an appraisal job in Lincoln and stopped at Virgil's gate on an impulse he later described as idle curiosity. He walked the yard, noted that the bone pile at the low corner was smaller than he remembered, noted the calcination oven, and what appeared to be a larger wood-fired kiln that had not been there 4 years prior. Virgil showed him a finished cup from the second kiln. Dale turned it over in his hands and held it up toward the afternoon sky. "Still a hobby," Dale said. He set the cup down on the fence rail with deliberate care. "You're getting translucency, I'll grant you that. But the body has variation. You'd never get this past a commercial buyer. The consistency isn't there." Virgil said, "I know." Dale picked up the cup again. He turned it a second time in his hands. He set it down. "It's a folk art operation," Dale said. "That's not a bad thing. There's a market for that. But bone china, as a commercial proposition, requires milling equipment you don't have and quality controls you're not running. I'll be direct with you. What you're making is a curiosity. Lovely, but a curiosity." Virgil thanked him for coming by. Dale Fitch drove to Lincoln with the cup sitting on the passenger seat of his sedan, and he did not remember leaving it there until he was 50 miles gone. What Dale did not know, because Virgil had not mentioned it, was that the larger kiln in the yard was a downdraft wood fire kiln of Virgil's own construction, built across the preceding 18 months from plans he had drawn himself after a correspondence with a ceramics professor at a state university in Missouri. The professor had been skeptical of Virgil's premise at first, that a rural cattle operator without formal training could develop a viable bone china production method from salvaged slaughterhouse bone, but the samples Virgil had mailed had changed the tone of the correspondence. By 2007, they had been exchanging letters and occasionally telephoning for 14 months. The professor's name was Dr. Edna Cho, and she had told Virgil in her last letter that the calcium phosphate content of his calcined bone was, by the analysis she had run on a sample he mailed, within 5% of the historical standard set by the original English bone china manufacturers of the early 19th century. She had used the phrase genuinely exceptional source material and underlined it. Virgil had not shared this with Dale either. His granddaughter Inez arrived in the summer of 2008. She was 22, fresh from 2 years of a business degree she had abandoned in her second year at a school in Kearney, and she came home to her parents' farm, adjacent to Virgil's, with a specific dissatisfaction she could not fully name. She had gone to Kearney partly to prove to herself that the world outside Colfax County made sense, and it had not made sense any more than the county did, just in different and more expensive ways. She started spending evenings at Virgil's workbench, not because she was interested in ceramics, but because her grandfather was there, and the barn was quiet, and the work had a logic she found calming. She watched him mix body clay. She asked questions. He answered them directly, without condescension. The same way he answered questions about cattle nutrition or hay moisture content. For the first month, she was mostly polite. She thought the bone china project was, if she was honest with herself, a reasonable hobby for a man in his mid-40s who had the cattle covered and time in the evenings. She had seen the Dale Fitch card on the windowsill above the workbench and had looked it up out of curiosity and found that Dale Fitch had a genuine regional reputation in ceramics assessment. A man like that, calling something a hobby, carried weight she was reluctant to dismiss. She kept these thoughts to herself. She watched Virgil work. She watched him hold a finished piece up to the light. "Why does the bone make it different?" she asked him one evening, holding a fired cup up to the single overhead bulb. "The calcium phosphate forms a glassy matrix inside the clay when it fires," Virgil said without looking up from his wedging. "Acts like an internal glaze. Light hits those glass-face crystals and bends. That's what you're seeing." She looked at him. "You knew that, and you kept doing it anyway," she said, "even when that man said it was a hobby." "Dale Fitch was right about most of it," Virgil said. "I didn't have the consistency. Not yet." She started coming every evening. The summer of 2009 was when Virgil installed the ball mill, a 200-pound investment in equipment he had been saving toward for 3 years. A ball mill is a rotating drum lined with ceramic or steel media used to grind raw materials to a uniform particle size. The consistency problem Dale had identified in 2007 was a particle size problem. Virgil's hand-ground bone ash and feldspar had varied too widely in fineness, which meant the firing results varied from piece to piece. A ball mill reduced that variance to near zero. He ran his first fully milled body through the downdraft kiln in November of 2009 and opened it on a Monday morning in December, Inez standing beside him. The pieces inside were uniform in color, in translucency, in surface finish. Every piece. Inez said a word Virgil did not repeat. He just nodded. She stood in front of the open kiln for a long moment in the December cold. She picked up a tea bowl and turned it in her hands and held it up toward the gray morning sky the way Dale Fitch had held Virgil's cup in 2007, and the wall of the piece glowed faintly luminous against the overcast. Not art, chemistry. The calcium phosphate had done what the library book said it would do, and the library book had been right, and her grandfather had known it would be right for the better part of a decade, while a ceramics buyer from Omaha had called the operation a hobby and a business school in Kearney had taught her about market segmentation and supply chain optimization, and the tea bowl in her hands on a December morning in Colfax County was worth more than any of that. She had not thought she was a doubter until that moment revealed her as one. She set the bowl down carefully. They spent the next 2 days wrapping the pieces in newspaper and stacking them in a cardboard box. Virgil wrote a short letter to Dr. Cho in Missouri and included 3 pieces as samples, along with a photograph of the open kiln. Dr. Cho's reply arrived in January of 2010. She had taken the pieces to a colleague in the materials science department. The bone ash content of the clay body, calculated by reverse analysis of the fired samples, came in at 34%. The calcium phosphate purity was 91%, slightly above the historical English standard. The translucency measurement, taken with a standard spectrophotometer, registered within the range of documented Josiah Spode era bone china from the early 1800s. Dr. Cho had underlined that sentence 3 times. The letter was 2 pages long. The last paragraph told him he would strongly recommend Virgil not continue to describe the operation as a hobby. "What you have in those boxes is the real article," Dr. Cho had written. Chet Dolan, in January of 2010, received a letter of his own. It was a 30-day notice from the regional kitchen goods chain that they were canceling his production contract due to a consolidation with a large commercial supplier in Ohio. Chet had been running both kilns at capacity for 18 months. He had $17,000 of raw material inventory, $9,000 of finished goods, and a note payment due in March on the second kiln. He came over to Virgil's barn that evening and sat at the workbench and did not say much. Virgil poured 2 cups of coffee and did not say much either. "You need any help in here?" Chet said eventually. "Not yet," Virgil said, "but maybe." By 2011, the Slaughterhouse easement had been paying Virgil its annual $140 for 22 years, and the pile at the low corner of his property had grown through that time into something closer to a low ridge, bleached and orderly as archaeology. Virgil had been pulling from it selectively since 2004, working through perhaps a third of it by his estimate. He and Inez had begun keeping careful records of which portions of the pile produced bone with the highest density and the cleanest calcination. And they had found a pattern: the long bones from the fall processing season, when the cattle were older and heavier, calcined cleaner and whiter, and produced a higher purity ash than the spring bone. They had started tagging the pile sections by season and year, the same way you would tag a field with its planting history. To the slaughterhouse, those bones were a disposal problem that cost them slightly less than $140 a year to solve. To Virgil and Inez, they were a raw material with a known chemistry and a 14-year supply history. Dale Fitch came back a 3rd time in the spring of 2012. He had not been invited. He had read a short article in a regional craft magazine that mentioned a bone china operation in Colfax County, Nebraska, with no photograph, and he had put the address together from county records and driven out on a Saturday morning. Virgil was in the barn. Inez was at the wheel, throwing a set of tea bowls. Dale stood in the barn door and watched her for a moment. "Still a folk art shop?" he said. "You said that," Virgil said from behind him. Dale turned. He looked at the kiln, which was larger now, a second downdraft chamber added to the original. He looked at the ball mill. He looked at the drying racks, which held 64 greenware pieces in various stages. He looked at Inez. "What are you selling these for?" he said. Virgil told him. Dale stood very still for a moment. "Per piece," Dale said. Per piece, Virgil said. To who? A restaurant in Lincoln that sources regional tableware. A kitchen goods shop in Omaha that contacted us after the article. 3 private buyers Dr. Cho referred us to through the university. Virgil paused. And Inez is talking to someone in Kansas City. Dale looked at the tea bowls on the wheel. I told you it was a hobby, he said. You told me the truth as you saw it, Virgil said. I didn't have the consistency yet. You were right. Dale did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, Can I pick one up? Virgil nodded at the drying rack. Dale lifted a tea bowl, still green and damp, and held it carefully. He turned it. He set it down. I owe you an apology, Dale said. You were working from what you saw, Virgil said. A man can only do that. The drought came in the summer of 2012 and did not fully lift until the late fall of 2013. In Colfax County, it was measured in the way droughts are measured in Nebraska, by the county average yield per acre, by the date of last meaningful rain, and by how many operations did not survive it. The county average corn yield in 2012 was 41 bushels per acre, against a normal year average of 162. Chet Dolan's pasture went hard and brown by June. His hay production fell to 1/3 of his typical cut. He had been running a small cow-calf herd alongside his pottery operation since the contract cancellation 2 years prior. A modest start, and he lost 11 head through the summer to pasture failure and had to sell the rest in August at distressed prices. The second tunnel kiln, which he had never managed to fully retire, on the note, went back to the lender that October. Virgil's bone supply did not care about the drought. The Slaughterhouse operated on its own calendar 3 miles north on municipal water, and the trucks came, as they had always come. He lost some hay tonnage like everyone else, and he sold his cow-calf herd down to a manageable number in July, but the calcination oven and the downdraft kilns ran on wood from his fence lines and the elm stand, which the drought had actually thinned usefully. He and Inez fired through the summer and the fall, steady as always. The Kansas City conversation Inez had been having since 2012 was with a specialty tableware importer named Howard Streck, who sourced domestic craft ceramics for high-end restaurant supply. Howard had driven to Colfax County twice to see the operation, asked questions about capacity and consistency, received samples that he had submitted to a materials testing laboratory in Chicago without telling Virgil. The lab's report arrived at Howard's office in September of 2013. He called Virgil the same afternoon. The report measured the bone china classification of the submitted samples against the international standard, which requires a fired calcium phosphate content of 30% or above, a specific translucency range, and a whiteness index within a defined band. Virgil's pieces met all 3. They met the translucency threshold at a figure 13% above the minimum. The whiteness index put them in the upper quartile of documented bone china specimens the laboratory had processed. The report used the phrase, consistent with premium British bone china of the mid-20th century. Howard said he wanted to place a purchase order. He said the price Virgil and Inez had been charging their regional customers was too low for the Kansas City market, and he named a figure. He said he could take 48 place settings per quarter to start, pending their capacity. Virgil sat with the phone against his ear for a moment. $460 per place setting, Howard said again, in case Virgil had not heard it. Virgil had heard it. He thanked Howard and said he would call back the next morning. He set the receiver down and walked outside to where Inez was stacking firewood for the next kiln load. She looked up at him. Kansas City called, he said. She waited. He told her the number. Inez set down the piece of wood in her hand and looked at it for a moment, and then at her grandfather. She did not say anything right away. The dog, a red heeler named Brock, lifted his head from the ground beside the wood pile and looked at both of them. $460 per place setting. The number landed on everything around it with the quiet force of a verdict. It did not arrive as a surprise. It arrived as an arithmetic confirmation of something they had known for years and had not yet been able to say in a currency anyone else would recognize. Virgil called Howard Streck back the next morning and accepted the order. The invoice crossed Howard's desk in October of 2013, and when it was paid in full, Virgil and Inez sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and the check and did not say very much. Brock lay at Virgil's feet in the usual way. The lamp over the table was the same lamp that had been there since Virgil's father put it up. The library book from 1947 was still on the shelf in the front room, the corner of the calcium phosphate chapter still dog-eared after 10 years. Dale Fitch drove back to Colfax County in the spring of 2014, this time with a question rather than a clipboard. He had left the ceramics buying business the previous fall and taken a position consulting for a regional arts and crafts grant program, and he wanted to know if Virgil would be willing to be evaluated for a documentation project the program was running on heritage craft manufacturing in the Plains States. He sat at Virgil's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and did not open a notebook right away. He looked at the lamp above the table and at the library book visible on the shelf in the front room, and at the composition notebook on the counter beside the stove, which had been joined by 2 more notebooks by then, the cattle records and the bone china records now filling separate volumes. "I've been thinking about what I said in 2007, Dale said. Virgil waited. "I was right about the technical deficiency," Dale said. "You didn't have the particle consistency. That was accurate." He paused. "What I missed was the source material. I looked at the operation, and I didn't look at the pile." "Most people don't look at the pile," Virgil said. Dale nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee cup. It was a standard diner mug, not one of Virgil's pieces. Virgil had not offered one of his pieces, and Dale did not ask, and both of them understood why without saying it. Virgil said he would think about the documentation project. He thought about it for 3 weeks and then agreed, on the condition that the documentation include a full account of the calcination method and the bone quality findings in enough technical detail that another person could attempt to reproduce the process. The program agreed. Dale hired a writer from Lincoln who spent 2 days at the operation that fall, and the documentation ran to 22 pages. What happened in the months that followed was quieter than a newspaper story and more durable. Chet Dolan, who had spent the 2 years since the drought rebuilding his operation on a smaller and entirely debt-free footing, came to ask Virgil if there was a market for a simpler stoneware line that could sit alongside the bone china pieces at a lower price point. Virgil said he did not know, but that Inez might. Inez said she thought there was, and the 2 operations began sharing the regional accounts. Chet built a small wood-fired kiln of his own, following plans Virgil drew for him, and stopped feeding the gas infrastructure entirely. 3 neighbors attended the firing of Chet's kiln in October of 2014. One of them asked Virgil afterward whether the bone ash process could work with hog bone, because there was a small-scale hog processing operation 2 counties over that had a disposal problem of its own. Virgil said he did not know and would look into it. He looked into it that winter and found that hog bone produced a lower purity calcium phosphate than cattle bone, somewhere in the range of 78 to 83%, depending on the diet and age of the animal, which put the fired translucency below the bone china standard. He wrote up his findings in a 2-page note and mailed it to Dr. Cho in Missouri, who wrote back that she thought the findings were publishable and asked whether he would be willing to co-author a short technical paper. The paper appeared in a regional materials science journal in 2016. Virgil Pratt was listed as the first author. Dale Fitch read it. He drove back to Colfax County that fall for the 5th time, and this time he stayed for 3 days and took notes, and he went back to Omaha and applied for a documentation grant on Virgil's behalf. The grant was awarded the following spring. Let me tell you what the Slaughterhouse easement amounted to in the end, because the arithmetic is the story. 14 years of bone at $140 per year totaled $1,960 paid to Virgil Pratt for the use of his low corner. The bone pile that accumulated over those 14 years, selectively processed at a rate of approximately 800 pounds of raw bone per year, yielded roughly 400 pounds of calcined bone ash annually after loss to moisture and organic matter. At Virgil's standard body composition, that ash was sufficient raw material for approximately 300 finished pieces per year, not including test firings and seconds. At the price point the Kansas City importer established in 2013, and which had since become the baseline for Virgil and Inez's production, the 14-year bone accumulation represented, if converted fully into finished tableware and sold at current prices, a figure well north of $2 million in recoverable material, most of it sitting in a pile that a slaughterhouse had paid $140 a year to dispose of. The arithmetic was never the point. What was the point was simpler. Virgil did not scale the operation. He and Inez continued firing 4 to 6 times per year, releasing pieces in small batches, selling at prices the work warranted, rather than at prices the market would bear if he had been willing to compromise the process. He refused 2 investment offers and 1 partnership inquiry from a kitchenware company in Denver that wanted to attach his name and method to a larger production line. He kept the bone china work at the scale the bone pile, and the 2 kilns, and the 2 of them could manage. He paid off the test kiln note, which had been modest, and set aside enough to re-roof the barn and repair the truck. The rest he put into the operation. Inez became the one who met the buyers who drove to Kansas City and Omaha, and once to a restaurant in Lincoln, where the chef had been serving Virgil's plates for 2 years and wanted to discuss a custom commission. She had the conversation Virgil would not have had. She told them the method, not to impress them, but because the method was the explanation for the price. She told them about the ball mill and the downdraft kiln and the calcium phosphate and the relationship between the fineness of the ash and the translucency of the fired body. She told them about the library book from 1947. She told them about her grandfather standing at the fence in the spring of 2003, watching a truck unload bones. One of the buyers, a restaurant supply buyer from Kansas City named Marta Voss, sat across a table from Inez in Lincoln and held a dinner plate up to the window light. The plate warm from the display case, translucent at the rim in the way that still registered as slightly impossible to anyone seeing it for the first time. He understood what it was before he had the tools to make it, Marta said. He understood what it could be, Inez said. That's different. There is a particular kind of knowledge that travels in books and credentials and projections, and it is not a bad kind of knowledge. Dale Fitch had it, and used it honestly, and was mostly right. The commercial ceramic market rewarded consistency at scale, and Virgil's operation in 2007 was not consistent at scale, and Dale's assessment was accurate at that moment. That kind of knowledge reads what is in front of it and reports what it sees, and what it tends to see is what is already measurable. The other kind of knowledge is slower and does not carry credentials. It lives in 14 years of watching a bone pile change with the seasons, in the calcium phosphate diagram of a library book held under a single lamp, in the note-taking that runs alongside cattle records in the same composition notebook, because the operation is one thing and not two. It knows things about a specific piece of ground and a specific supply of raw material and a specific behavior of fire that no buyer visiting on a Saturday morning can read from a fence post assessment. It does not explain itself well to clipboards. It waits. What Virgil Pratt had, that Dale Fitch did not have in 2007, was not stubbornness, though it looked like stubbornness from the road. It was the willingness to stay inside a specific problem, long enough for the problem to yield its actual shape. The bone pile was not a disposal problem. The bone pile was a calcium phosphate deposit with a known replenishment rate and a chemistry that happened to match the historical requirements of one of the most valued ceramic traditions in the world. Knowing that required the library book and the correspondence with Dr. Cho and the 7 years of failed test firings and the ball mill and the December morning in 2009 when Inez said a word her grandfather did not repeat. The Slaughterhouse ended the easement agreement in 2015, having found a rendering contractor willing to take the material at a better rate. The last truck came in late November of that year, and the driver, a younger man who had taken over the route 2 years prior, waved at Virgil from the cab as he pulled out. Virgil raised a hand back. The ridge of bone at the low corner sat undisturbed after that. The inventory of 14 years, now entirely in Virgil and Inez's custody, sorted and tagged and sequenced by season and year. Inez married a man from Platte County in 2017 and brought him into the work. His name was Ray, and he had been a general contractor before the marriage and had the mechanical patience the work required. He learned the calcination slowly, the way everyone learned it, sitting beside the oven through the 2-day firing, with a temperature log and a pen, not asking to rush it. He learned the kiln loading more slowly still, because loading a downdraft kiln well requires an understanding of the fire's path through the chamber that cannot be read from a diagram, but has to be absorbed through a season of openings, noting what emerged from each position and why. He learned the wedging last. She handed him the composition notebook the way Virgil had handed it to her, without ceremony, the way you hand someone a tool they will need. He opened it to the first page. Virgil's handwriting ran from the top margin to the bottom in the close, level script of a man who does not waste space. Ray looked at it for a long moment and then closed it and set it on the bench and went back to the clay. Virgil, in his early 70s by then, still fired every kiln, still carried the library book on the shelf in the front room, still fed the dog. Brock had given way to another red heeler by then, a younger one Inez had picked out of a litter from a neighboring farm, same coloring and same temperament, and Virgil had named him the same name without being asked. The dog sat at his feet in the evenings while he wedged clay at the bench, the overhead lamp making a warm circle in the barn dark. There is a word in ceramics for the change that fire makes in clay, the point at which the raw material becomes something new and unrepeatable. The word is vitrification. It is when the silicates in the body begin to melt and fuse, when what was granular becomes glassy, when the wall of a cup goes from opaque to translucent in the span of a few degrees of heat. You cannot see it happening. You only see the result when you open the kiln. Most of the people who drive past a 42-acre parcel in Colfax County see a small operation on ordinary ground. They see an old barn, a gravel lot, a low ridge of pale material along the property line that reads as debris. They do not see 14 years of raw material in inventory, or the chemistry waiting inside it, or the knowledge required to turn one into the other. The bone pile was never waste. It was always the work, waiting for someone patient enough to do it.